Welcome to the College Park Church of Christ Sermon Series podcast. This sermon was recorded at the College Park Church of Christ in the Conroe Porter area. Join us for worship on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Thanks for studying the Word of God with us.
Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Tonight we're going to continue our series on From Creation to Christ. And what we've talked about so far is we've talked about from this roadmap that we have, is we've talked about the creation, the fall, the flood, and those topics are talking about a group of people, the people as a whole, everyone here on the earth. And then we've also talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, which talks about a town, two cities that were destroyed by God for the actions that they were doing that wasn't according to God. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. And what this is going to do is take that story that we've had a wide story on about everyone on earth, and we're going to bring it down to a certain lineage of people. And we're going to start with this and talk about how this lineage all kicks off, starting with Abraham going into Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. And so with that, I've titled this sermon, The Birth of a Nation, because we're going to talk about the birth of two children, that one of them will become the nation that we are going to continue this series through. So to start it off with it, we're going to jump right in and talk about Isaac. And when you talk about Isaac, you can't help but talk about a little bit about Abraham and Sarah. And so we talked, Timothy mentioned on Sunday, talking about how Abraham was told to leave the land of Ur and go all the way down to a place that he did not know, but God will reveal to him once he gets there. And he follows that, and they talk about the two, talks about a covenants that were, that he had between him and God. The first one would be where it was unto the seed given land from the river of Egypt all the way over to the great river, the Euphrates. And there was another circumcision covenant talking about he was going to multiply his seed exceedingly. And so this is kind of interesting because he's talking about multiplying the seed exceedingly, but Sarah was barren. She was not able to have children. And so I'm sure in Abraham's mind coming into this, he was like, well, I'm just not going to have children because my wife is barren. But he was promised a son. And so through this promise, Sarah grew impatient, I can only understand, and offered up Hagar, Sarah's handmaid, to give him a son to continue on his seed, to continue on this promise. And so that's where we get Ishmael to be born. Now later on, there is a dissension that's happened between Sarah and Hagar due to this connection, this union between Abraham and Hagar. And later on, we read in Genesis 17:19, it says, "And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him." Now Abraham is about 99 years old, or he is 99 years old at this point, and God has told him, you're going to have a son basically within a year, and I will give you a son in a year. Now, he also comes in, now this happens before destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he steps in and says, hey, I have a son, his name is Ishmael, kind of already knew that, and he said, what about him? Isn't it supposed to go to him? But God told him, the covenant is going to be with his son Isaac, the promised son Isaac, but he will still make Ishmael a nation of 12 men and continue on the seed from Ishmael. And when Isaac's about 25 to 37 years old, I couldn't really lock down an age for Isaac at this point, when it becomes to a point where he's going to be sacrificed. Josephus' accounts puts him at about 25. The rabbinic tradition puts him at right around 37, but I couldn't lock it down into a very specific time, so he's within that age. And it comes to a time whenever God asks Abraham to go off and sacrifice Isaac. And we start this story in Genesis 22, 1 through 2, and it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Now, you know I had talked about him having two sons, but at this point, God is telling him his only son. So Ishmael had got sent off, and that was kind of happening during the previous verse that we talked about. And he was sending him off, and God was telling him, don't worry about him. I will watch over him. I will help him through life. But he needs to be sent off so that way, listen to Sarah because she wants him sent off. So in this time, he now, like Abraham naturally does, he rises up and he obeys God and goes out and gets gets Isaac and two guys and takes him to an area that God eventually ends up showing him. And he leaves the guys down on the ground and takes them up there. And on their way up there, Isaac asks Abraham, well, I see the logs and I see the fire, but where is the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide. Abraham is still sitting there walking up on a mountain, in his mind convinced that he's going to sacrifice Isaac. And he still says, God will provide. He still hangs on that God will provide a sacrifice for him. And they get to the very top of that, they get to the spot where he needs to. He puts the wood and he binds up Isaac and puts him on top of this. And he was fully in his mind ready to sacrifice his son. And he takes that knife and right when in his mind, I believe in his mind, whenever he was going to come down, God steps in and says, no, stop. And then he provides a ram stuck in the thicket that saves his son, that now is going to be the sacrifice, and that's now going to be the burnt offering to God. And so at that point, they do the burnt offering, they perform the sacrifice, and then they go on and move on to what they were doing. They move on to different areas. Now, soon after this time, so when Isaac was about 37, Sarah passes away. So it was sometime after this sacrifice that Sarah ends up passing away. And then when Isaac was about 40 years old, Abraham didn't want him to marry a Canaanite woman. And so he wanted him to marry someone from his country. So that's where we get to the marriage to Rebekah. And so he takes his servant, and he tells his servant to go back to my country, or to go back to his country, which is the land of Ur. And he ends up stopping in Haran, but he tells him to go there and find a wife for my son Isaac, so that way he can have a wife from my country. And he listens and does exactly what he was supposed to do. He promises, he leaves and takes camels and goes there. And on the way there, or when he's almost there at a well, he talks to God, he prays to God, and he says, I will ask a woman or tell a woman to get me a drink, and if she gets me a drink and then feeds my camels, then that's the woman that you have chosen to be the wife of Isaac. And so at that time, Rebekah walks up, and he tells Rebekah, give me drink. And she gives him drink, and immediately goes and then gives the camels drink. And so he knows that this is the woman that God wants Isaac to marry. So with that, he tells her who he is, and they go back and they have a conversation with her father, and they all agree, and Rebekah is now sent over there back to Abraham and Isaac, so that way they may perform this marriage. And when they get there, Rebekah saw Isaac, and Isaac saw her, and they loved each other, and so we read about it in Genesis 24:67, and it says, Isaac brought her into his mother's Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So what we can see is that Sarah's tent was still built 3 years after she had passed away, and so it was in her tent that they were now married. And this takes us to the next section where we're going to talk about the children, about Jacob and Esau, the children that came from this union between Isaac and Rebekah. And ultimately, we're going to start talking about the birth. So one thing to note here is that Rebekah, like Sarah, her mother-in-law, was barren as well. And so Isaac stepped in and talked to God and said, can you help out? Can you help her to be with child? And God said yes, and he opened up a womb, and she became with child. Now, at one time, I'm sure being a new mother, she started having issues. We can read about it in Genesis 25:22, and it said, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire in the Lord. So she's a new mother. Well, she's just first time being pregnant, and all of a sudden she's having what seems like a lot of complications. She didn't know what was going on. She just knew there was pain going on and seemed like a lot of rattling. So she went to the Lord. And she talked to the Lord and said, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So now God is telling her there is 2 babies in your womb, and that's the reason why there's so much going on. And there's also, these 2 babies are going to be 2 different nations in your womb. And it's also, we're going to do something a lot more that's not typical within this, with a group of people, is that the older is going to be serving the younger. Typically, the younger, or everyone younger serves the older person, the oldest person in the family. So we go to verse 24, and it says, and when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. So now she can see, like physically see that, yes, God said there were 2 twins inside of you, and now she can physically see that there are twins inside of you. And we continue in verse 25, where we talk about the birth, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. Now Esau means hairy or rough textured, so it kind of fits with what exactly she saw when he was born. Continue in verse 26, it says, and after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. So Jacob means a supplanter, or one who follows by the heel. So he was grabbing and followed by the heel. And so that's, the names kind of just, I believe the names were defined after the fact, because, we kind of define it with an example. So, let's continue on to verse 27, and it says, and the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. So what we can see here is Esau hunted, was a hunter, and Jacob was the one that was there in the tents, and that was there taking care of things at home. The other thing that we see in the next verse is when it says, and Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So now we have a point here to where now the parents have their favorites. And the dad's favorite is because he gets meat, and the mom is because I'm sure that he helps with the motherly things and takes care of everything going on. I don't think having a favorite child is the best thing. I don't have a favorite child. I have ones that I kind of relate better to because they act more like me, and but that's about as far as that goes. So, and with that, this brings us to the next section, which is the birthright section. Now, birthright is referred to the tradition of privileges of the firstborn son. The firstborn son would get a double portion of the inheritance and the leadership of the family. So Esau has that birthright over Jacob. But keep in mind, these rights can also be sold, as we're going to see in this next part of the story, in Genesis 25:29-30, which reads, and Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. So apparently Esau did not do very well out hunting, and so he came in, he was super, super hungry, and Jacob was at home basically making some pottage. He was making some lentils. And Esau really, really wanted that because he was super hungry. In verses 31-32, it says, and Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? So Jacob saw an opening to get that birthright, and so he made a deal. Sell me your birthright, I'll give you food, you won't die. And he's like, well, fine, I'm going to die. If I'm going to die, the birthright means nothing. So, the next verse he says, swear to me, Jacob said, swear to me this day, and And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So Esau had a carnal thought process. He was a thought process of, I'm worried about what I'm going to do today, and I'm not worried about that future portion of that birthright that would come along later on. And there's even a story later on that I don't have the verse up for, but it talks about him marrying a couple Hittite women of the Hittites, and that was not the best thing because they were from a family that were deep in transgression with God. And if the one that you're hitching your life to is trying to pull you away, eventually those types of things can happen. So, and with that marrying of the Hittite women, that grieved Isaac and Rebekah because they could see that going on. You are the one, you are the birthright in the family, and now you're hitching yourself to someone that is not, going to do the right things and going to help you go the right way in your life. So some years down the road, I really couldn't find years down the road, we get to where Isaac has now gotten a lot older, and he got to where he can't see very well, if anything. And so we read in Genesis 27, 3 through 4, and it says, Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver and thy bow, and go out to the field, and take me some venison, and make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die. So he's talking to Esau here, and he tells Esau, look, he's going to give him the blessing, and he says, but you need to go out, and you need to get me some venison and make it the way I like it to be made, and then I will give you the blessing when we eat. Well, Rebekah was sitting there and overheard this and said, okay, she ran straight over there to Jacob and said, look, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go out there, you're going to get some animal, you're going to get a couple of lambs, you're going to bring them in, we're going to cut them, we're going to cook them, you're going to put the fur on so that way you can be like Esau when you go see your father. And that's exactly what he did. We read in Genesis 27:10, it says, And thou shalt bring it to thy father, that he may eat, and that he may bless thee before his death. So this is her telling him that now that we have the meat, and you've put on this animal skin that makes you seem like your brother, now you need to go and to take this to your father, and you need to be like Esau when you're there, so that way you can get that blessing. And Jacob even said, well, what if I'm found out? This would look really bad on me. And Rebekah said, don't worry about that. I'll take that on. You just go ahead and do what I'm telling you to do, and then we can move forward. And so he does exactly what he's supposed to do, and we go to Genesis 27:20, and Isaac said unto his son, How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord thy God brought it to me. So Jacob, playing as Esau, walks into a room and says he's here to give him his meat, and of course the voice is different. But even at that, he's like, well, how can you get it that fast? I just sent you away not that long ago. He's like, well, the Lord blessed me for it. So he goes through, and he asked him a couple questions. He asked him to come close, and sure enough, he felt his hands, and was like, okay, you are hairy like my son. You don't sound like my son Esau, but you are hairy like my son Esau. And he even went on, and so since he could not figure out whether or not it was him or not, we read in Genesis 27:23, and it says, And he discerned him not, because his hands were hairy as his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. So, like I said, his hands were hairy, and it felt just like his brother Esau, but he still didn't sound like his brother Esau. So Isaac basically got him to come close, and then he smelled him, and he was like, you smell like Esau too. So, okay, that convinced him fully, and he gives him the blessing soon after this verse, and we read in 28 and 29, it says, Therefore God give thee of the dew of the heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. So, I couldn't find out exactly how fast Jacob left after this blessing, but he did end up leaving soon afterwards. And then a little bit of time after that, Esau came in with what he was supposed to do. And then he tells Isaac, I am here, where is my blessing? And Isaac was like, weren't you just here a little bit ago that I gave the blessing to? And it worked out to where they figured it was Jacob that was there, and it was not Esau. So then Esau was not very happy with that, and he comes in verse 38 and says to his father, hast thou but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. So now he cares about that birthright, and he wants the blessing from his father. And so but he's sitting here saying, I know you gave one to my brother Jacob, thinking it was me, but can you please give me a blessing as well? Well, Isaac thinks about it, and he responds in 39 and 40 and gives him that blessing and says, and Isaac said to his father and answered and said unto him, behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth and of the dew of the heaven from above, and by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt thou serve thy brother, and it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. So at this point, we can look and see that this is that fulfillment of what was told to Rebekah, that one son were served, the older were served the younger. And this is where we see that, and that's what Isaac is telling Esau here. And right after receiving that blessing, we read in verse 41, it says, and Esau hated Jacob because he of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning of my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. So he was so angry at this point for the blessing being stolen from him that he was willing to kill his brother at that point. Well, Rebekah is just in the right point at the right spot every single time, and she learns of this. And as soon as she learns of this, she goes to Jacob and says, you need to go away for 3 days, go over to my brother's house, Laban, and hang out there for 3 days, and I'll call you back when it's time. So then she comes up with a plan to where she goes to talk to Isaac, because what she wants to do is get it to where Isaac sends him over there, so that way he can find a wife. And we read about that in Genesis 27:46, which reads, and Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as this which are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? So she's talking to him, saying he needs to go find a wife somewhere else. And so Isaac heard that, and I would assume that he understood that, and he responds in Genesis 28:5, and it says, and Isaac sent away Jacob, and he went to Paddan Aram unto Laban, son of Bethuel the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. So now he is sent away, and basically he is fleeing to there. I know that Isaac sent him, but initially he was fleeing to get away from from what was going to happen from his brother Esau. Now when he gets over there, he walks up to a well, and he meets Rachel at the well, where he opens up and he feeds her sheep, her lamb. And at the time, he tells her who he is and what he is there for. And when she hears about it, she runs over to Laban, her father. And she tells him about it. And we read his response in Genesis 29:13. It says, and it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. So he goes through that story, and Laban says, okay, you're going to reside here for a while. You're going to serve, but you can't serve for free. Okay? And so he says, what shall I pay you to serve me here while we're here? Well, Jacob only had one thing in his mind, and that was the woman that he met at the well. So he responds in verse 18 and says, "And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter." So Laban thought about it and said, "It is better that I give her to thee than I should give her to another man. So abide with me for those 7 years, and you will have Rachel as your wife." So 7 years passed. I assume he worked very, very hard in those 7 years. So then he walks up in verse 21 and said unto Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her." So he says, "I'm ready. I've served. Let me have my payment for that." So Laban says, "All right, no problem." And he makes a really big feast and gets everything all nice and fun and happy. And then he gives his daughter over to Jacob. And we read about the outcome in Genesis 29:25. And it says, "And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me?" So he didn't get what he actually worked for. He ended up getting Leah, the older sister. And so when he's talking to Laban, Laban says, "Look, in this country, we can't marry the younger daughter without the older daughter being married first, so I gave you her. But if you will fulfill her week, I will give you her, then you can work 7 more years for her as well." So he did exactly that, and we read about in 28, in verse 28, it says that Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. So now Jacob leaves to find a wife and ends up with 2 wives, and he ends up conceiving with Leah, because there was anger and strife against Leah, so God made it to where Rachel could not have children for a period of time. And Rachel made the same discernment that Sarah made and said, "You can have my handmaid, and you can have children through my handmaid that will kind of be with me, be through me." Her handmaid was Bilhah. And then eventually Rachel was able to have children with Jacob. And then once Leah found out that she was no longer able to conceive, she gave her handmaid over, Zilpah, over to her to have more children. And all of this came up to be 12 children in total that he ended up having while he was in Paddan-aram. And read about that in Genesis 35:23 through 26. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. And the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob, which were born to him in Paddan-aram. So he is now sitting there. He has made a family, and there were 4 women that he's had 12 children with. And it was time for him at this point to go ahead and leave. And that's where we read about Jacob returning. God visits him and talks to him. We read about that in Genesis 31:3, and it says, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto thy land, thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So he leaves, and there was an issue to where they leave real quickly, and they didn't tell Laban they were actually leaving, and then Laban caught back up to them, and they ended up making amends, and so then Laban was actually saying, he said bye to all of his grandchildren and his daughters, and they moved on. And then at a time, Jacob went off and sent everyone ahead of him beforehand, and he was alone. And we read about this, what happened to him when he was alone, in Genesis 32:24 through 25. "And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him." So if you're looking at this section, he's basically wrestling with God, and he's not giving up. Jacob is not giving up, and so eventually, God turns around in verse 26 and says, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And Jacob said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." So he does end up receiving that blessing. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but we're going to continue on with the story. And we're going to and go look at Genesis 32:31, and it says, and he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. Now this word halted is basically saying he limped. So he now, after fighting with God, he had a limp everywhere he went, and it just kind of like hindered him for the rest of his life. So he continued on and came in and saw Esau. And when he saw Esau at the end, at this part of the travels, Esau had 400 men with him. And so at that point, Jacob says, okay, wives, take the children that with him. So he told Leah to take the children he had with Leah, Rebekah, the children he had with Rebekah, Bilhah, and the fourth one, I lost the name. But he separated them all up so that way if something did happen, if something happened to him, they could at least escape with their children and continue on. But as soon as Esau saw him, we read in Genesis 33:4, and it says, and Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So it's been at least 14 years that they've not seen each other, and that strife they had 14 years ago just didn't mean anything else when they saw each other, because they were happy to see each other and happy to talk again and be in the same household again, or under the same roof again. Soon after this, and we talk about, the next section we'll talk about is Jacob renamed to Israel. Now, part of that blessing, we can read back in Genesis 32:27 through 28, where it says, and he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. So this is part of that wrestling with God. This is what was happened. And his name he got renamed to Israel. It was mentioned again when God said, this is what you'll be known as. In Genesis 35:10, it says, and God said unto him, thy name is Jacob, thy name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. And he called his name Israel. And with that, he gave him a blessing. Starting in verse 11, it says, and God said unto him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins, and the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land. So he renames him to Israel, and then he says, you are now, this is the continuation of that covenant that I had with Abraham and moved over into Isaac, and now it is with you, and that is going to continue on. Real quickly, I want to talk about Esau, because he is the other brother. We can read in Genesis 36:7 through 8, and it says, for their riches were more than they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. Thus dwelt Esau in the Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. So Esau, his people become the Edomites. And the Israelites and Edomites could not live in the same area because they were way too large for that area, so they had to separate. Similar to the way that Abraham and Lot had to separate because they were too large for that area. So they move off. Now the Edomites moved off, and they had dealings back and forth with the Israelites throughout their history, but ultimately the end of the Edomites was that they merged back into Israel, and they all became one people again at the very end of the end of the Edomites. And that is how we had two nations that then became one nation, and that's what we're doing. What we're talking about is this is the start of where we follow a group of people. Everything else that we talk about is going to be following this group of people, this nation that God had set aside to follow the seed of Abraham, and that's what we're going to be talking about in all the rest of these sermons and all the rest of these talks. We could talk about the lineage of Jacob, but we're going to all talk about that over the next couple months.
Thanks for joining our Sermon Series podcast today. For more, check us out on YouTube or come worship with us on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings.